Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am honored and thrilled and so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Oliver Burkeman and Daniel Pink. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions, short introductions. Oliver Burkeman worked for many years at The Guardian, where he wrote a popular weekly column on psychology. This column will change your life. His books include the New York Times bestseller 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, and The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. Daniel Pink is the author of 7 books, including most recently, The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. We hosted Dan in 2022 on launch day for The Power of Regret, and it was an amazing event. Other books include the New York Times bestsellers When, we also hosted him for that, and A Whole New Mind, as well as the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell is Human. His books have won multiple awards, have been translated into 42 languages, I wonder which ones it has not been translated into, and have sold millions of copies around the world. We are very grateful to have Dan's participation this evening. And now let's welcome Oliver Burkeman and Dan Pink.
Thank you, Lonnie. Oliver, good evening. It turns out, for those of you watching from all corners of the world, that Oliver and I are both in Washington, D.C., but we're in separate locales. Oliver's in a hotel, and I'm in my garage. So, and that pretty much sums up our lives right there. So, Oliver, let me begin. Give us some background into how'd you come to do this? You've written these, like, I love 4,000 Weeks. I love this book. I told you beforehand that this book made me feel seen. Where'd you grow up, and how'd you come to be writing these kinds of books?
Wow. I'll try and give a short version because I feel like this is the kind of reply that could go on until everyone was kind of.
I'll cut you off. Don't worry.
Keeling over with quick version. I was born in Liverpool in UK, home of the Beatles, but I left when I was 1, so I'm not really a Scouser in that sense. I grew up mainly in York, in the north of England, fairly near where we now live, but lived in Brooklyn for a big chunk in the middle until just a few years ago. Actually, my wife's American. I worked as a journalist for many years. I think we even crossed paths at a stage very early on in my journalistic career at The Guardian. And I was always, I guess, more interested in what they slightly pompously call ideas journalism than news journalism. But I think I was into this stuff, the sort of broadly kind of psychology, personal development, self-help, if that's the term one has to use, at least partly all the way, because for reasons that were not just sort of purely professional, right? I mean, on some level, whether I admitted it to myself at the beginning or not, I wanted to, find ways to feel less overwhelmed and less anxious,
Sure.
and less like I was, failing in all the obligations I had in order to count as being an adequate human being. So that column that I then wrote for like sort of more than a decade, alarmingly, at the Guardian, really grew out of that, because an editor there saw that I was kind of furtively reading these kinds of books and thought she might as well get some content out of it. And it sort of started off I went on a sort of journey from cynicism to sincerity, because it started off with me being kind of sarcastic about bad self-help books.
Those early columns had a little kind of hyper skeptical tone to them. Yeah.
Turns out
snarky even.
Right. Turns out that when you find somebody constantly endlessly snarking at some specific thing over and over again, that might be a sign that, it's touched something in them. Also, like, if you're writing for the audience that I was writing for, similarly skeptical people, it turns out to be much more interesting and provocative and contrarian to identify the value, to actually point out that there is some value hiding in that stuff. So that was how I got into that. And then I could go on, but I guess 4,000 Weeks was the book I wrote after having tried out so many time management systems and productivity tricks that I had become completely disillusioned with the idea that there was a silver bullet that was going to save me from finitude.
And this book stands on the shoulders of 4,000 Weeks. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the thesis in 4,000 Weeks, and then how it led to this book, Meditations for Mortals, which is not a meditation book, but not a meditation book also. So how does this stand on the shoulders of 4,000 Weeks?
Well, I guess the basic idea of 4,000 Weeks is just to ask what happens if you look at the question of time management, of productivity, of choosing how to use time well, if you really take seriously what a kind of preposterously small amount of time we get. Don't even know how much that's going to be. We just know that it's going to be very, very finite. And also the kind of limited control that we have over how that time unfolds. So I was really sort of going deep in that book into the idea that, systems for trying to feel like you're getting on top of everything are not going to work because there is an infinite supply of stuff to be done. Attempts to feel totally secure about the future and unworried about what's coming next are not going to work if their premise is getting certainty about the future, because we don't, as limited finite humans, have that gift. And I was sort of charting all of those things. We can talk more about it if you like. This book really comes from my own, partly talking to lots of people in the aftermath of that book, but also my own realization, I don't know if you would agree, that you can have a really clear idea about like how you want to live your life, the things you want to be doing, the way you want to be showing up for people in your life. You can have a very clear idea of that and just not actually do it at all. So this book is really, it's definitely still in that theme about how we deal with the fact that we're so finite and we want so much more control and capacity than we can actually have. But it's really about, in my mind anyway, it's really about like, how do you cross that gap from knowing to actually doing? The word actually appears quite a bit in this book, even though my editor made me take some of them out. It's that sort of sense of actualliness, like okay with these perspective shifts, these new understandings of how we want to live a meaningful life, but how do you actually do it?
Yeah. And so to some extent, did you write this book for yourself?
Oh yeah, totally. And I say as much in it. I mean, I think that probably any book of advice, but that's in that kind of space is ultimately written for the author to figure things out for themselves as well. Not always admitted to, but absolutely, that sense that I had for a huge part of my earlier adulthood, that I was just on the verge of kind of, or maybe not just on the verge, maybe it was years away, but I was heading towards this situation when I would finally like know what I was doing in life, or be on top of things, be sorted out, fix my problems with procrastination or distraction, and figure out how to be a good writer or a good parent or a good partner, and then like at that point real life would finally begin. This book is really a sort of some kind of manifesto against that outlook, and it's only important to me because I had it for so long.
It's a manifesto against that. It's also a guidebook of sorts for how do you navigate that now suddenly reconfigured world. Now I'm gonna see you and raise you a little bit here, and that I think you wrote this book for me. Right. That's and I'm dead serious about that, because I said to my wife, as I was getting ready to coming over here to do this, is like, in this book, I felt seen. I want to read everybody a sentence that made me feel seen. All right, here we go. It's actually early in the book where Oliver says, "Few things feel more basic to my experience of adulthood than the vague sense that I'm falling behind and need to claw my way back to a minimum standard of output." That is essentially my daily experience. And so when I read this book, and I had the good fortune of reading a few months ago, it had me thinking differently. And I want to talk to you about sort of how, talk to us about how you configured this book, because this is not like your earlier books, which is, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, has a narrative that takes you all the way through, is a set of arguments. This is configured differently, and I think it makes it more attractive to readers. Tell us about that.
So one thing that was really important to me, if I was going to look at this topic of all the barriers that we put up, psychological barriers to actually getting around to the things that we know we care about, was that the book had to like not be yet another example of something that you read and think, oh, that's interesting. I'll put it into practice one day in the future when I get a spare moment. So I wanted it to actually attempt to sort of take readers over that gap from knowing to doing in itself. So it's divided into 4 weeks that sort of build on each other, and each of those weeks into 7 short chapters. And so this sort of invitation, as I put it in the book, is that you might read one of these each day for a month. A lot of the book is about not trying too hard to control things. So I think I need to recognize that I can't control how people read a book that they have. But the sort of suggestion is one a day or thereabouts. Even the idea of that, I think, is quite useful.
And that seems very doable, because these chapters are provocative and interesting and substantive, and yet they're 4 pages, 5 pages long.
They vary, but yes, they're all meant to be easily digestible in a few minutes in the course of a day. And really the hope there is that, instead of trying to sort of deliver some amazing new system for completely changing your life that never actually does anything, which I think is a very common situation because of some of what we've already discussed, it would be something that could actually kind of get each of these little perspective shifts, might make a little change to how you live through that 24 hours. And it might sort of get under your, I'm doing all these gestures you can't see, unless get under your skin, sink into your bones a little bit, and actually therefore really be a kind of active ingredient instead of another good theory.
So and it also fits into with some other themes in the book. Let me poke on 2. So you have this idea that the best things that we do are done not daily, but daily-ish. And you explode this very popular notion from Jerry Seinfeld, where Jerry Seinfeld said that the way, and I've talked about this, where Jerry Seinfeld had this technique where he would write every day, and every day that he would write, he would mark an X in the calendar, and he would look at that calendar with a string of X's and say, oh no, I can't not write today because I don't want to break the string of X's. Mm-hmm. And then you interviewed Jerry Seinfeld, and Jerry Seinfeld said something different.
Yeah, I mean, I think he sort of has done that to some extent, but he was just completely he thought it was hilarious that this little bit of throwaway advice he'd given to an aspiring comic, I think that's who it was, like years previously, had been turned into this kind of system that was supposedly revealing some great wisdom. And he says something like, in the interview, said something like, I can't believe there was anyone who thought this was useful advice. It's like, if you want to get good at something, do it a lot, do it most days. The work's, how could you ever believe that if you just sat there and did nothing, you were going to get better? So in other words, he wasn't talking about this kind of incredibly rigid consistency. If you break the streak, it's all over, high pressure, feel terrible about it, which we, that's what happens. You fall off the wagon for a day, and then it's like, you don't go back to it at all. He just means like this kind of athletic approach to skill, which I think is a big part of the way he's approached his career. It's like, you have to do it a lot. You have to do it more days than not, ideally. This word dailyish actually comes from Dan Harris, the meditation teacher and podcaster. And that's his answer when people ask him how regularly you should meditate, speaking now about formal seated meditation practice. And I just love that, because it's not as self-indulgent as you might think, right? There's quite a lot of discipline in the idea of dailyish, but there's none of that brittleness. It's like, there are times in life when maybe 4 times a week is dailyish, and that's what
you can do, and you're doing it dailyish. And like there is a sort of related kind of piece of advice in training for races and other kinds of athletic things. It's like, don't miss 2 days in a row. So it's not this kind of rigid, do it every single day, or else like you're going to break the streak and your whole sense of worth is going to collapse, but doing it daily-ish. And one of the things I do like about this book is some of the terms. So daily-ish, which is Dan Harris's, but you shine a nice light on it. Another word that you like, I think it's essentially a word that you planted the flag on, that you essentially own, is imperfectionism. Tell us about that and why it's important to both our productivity and our well-being.
Yeah, this is my proprietary label, you know,
Yeah.
so I can send.
I'm sorry,
royalties
imperfectionism,
yeah.
TM.
Right,
Sorry.
yeah. You have to pay me a little bit of money every time you say it. No, this is just an umbrella term, my umbrella term, yeah, for an outlook on life that sort of takes it, that starts from an acknowledgement of our limitations, right? That takes it as a given that you're always going to have too much to do. There's always going to be more meaningful things you could do than you're going to be able to do. That takes it as a given that you're never going to feel completely ready and like you know what you're doing, especially almost by definition, right? When we're talking about new ventures or new life stages or new projects, that takes it as a given that we can't ever fully understand what makes other people tick or what the future holds, and sort of says, okay, having at least somewhat dropped that perfectionistic demand for a total sense of security or control, like that's precisely when you can plunge into action now, and you will do it imperfectly, but you will do it in reality instead of in this sort of hypothetical future moment when you've got all your ducks in a row. So that's really what that is. And then all the different facets of this book are just sort of unpacking different techniques and different aspects of what I think of as an imperfectionist.
So give us one of those. Let's talk about another term that you use, which is productivity debt. Tell us what that is, and then tell us you have, I think, a very smart way to get out of productivity debt.
Productivity debt. When I first sort of mentioned this, I was amazed at how much it seemed to resonate. This is just the idea, which I think that a lot of us have, especially those people who psychologists, Dan, would call insecure overachievers. Another phrase.
No, that's a term that you have in there. That's in there. We'll come back to that. I don't identify as an insecure overachiever, because I'm 0 for 2 on those. But
if you're, I'd be very interested to talk about this because you're plainly an overachiever. But if you do it from a position of deep security, I wanna hear your secrets. But the basic idea of productivity debt is just this idea that we wake up in the morning feeling like if we don't if we don't deliver a certain amount of output into the world, that we somehow haven't quite earned our right to exist, right? That we haven't quite justified our existence. And obviously, if you work for money in any form, there is a kind of productivity debt that you have. You do have to do things for salary that you receive or whatever. But I'm talking about this kind of existential layer where it's like you're not okay as a human unless you've put in this output. And like the best you can hope for in that situation is that on a really good day, you might get back to zero balance.
Right, exactly.
Or it all starts again the next day.
Exactly. Have you felt that way?
Oh, completely. Yes.
Yeah,
no,
I have.
Absolutely.
I might have. I think I woke up this morning feeling that way.
And yet you deny being an insecure overachiever. I'm fascinated by.
No, I don't feel a sense of I feel a sense of frustration about that.
Okay.
I don't feel a sense of like insecurity about that. But anyway, we'll do in the next 10-minute block we'll do therapy of me. But tell us about.
Yeah, no, I mean the rest of it's therapy of me as well. Anyway, so right, I mean I really do have felt this, and to some extent still do, and I think there are all sorts of reasons for it, social, economic, as well as timeless human psychological things. One very simple intervention, and it's not necessarily a panacea. I'm not saying it solves everything, but one very simple intervention is just to keep a done list, right?
Yes.
Just to keep a list as you go through the day of the things that you have completed. So this is a rare kind of list that gets longer during the day and is meant to get longer during the day, unlike to-do lists, which do get longer during the day, but it's exactly the opposite of what you'd hoped for. And all that does is just gradually, but in a surprisingly powerful way, in my experience, shift your sort of default comparison that you're making from a comparison between what you've done and all the things that you could in theory do, which is always going to leave you feeling very bad about yourself, to one that is a comparison between what you've done and what you would have done if you
just sat there
in bed all day. Right.
It's like you're comparing it to zero rather than comparing it to, in mathematical terms, you're comparing it to a zero rather than to essentially something that is infinite.
Right. And so you're going to get a lot. It's going to be a much more heartening result. And I also add in that section, if you're going through a really bad patch, like nobody needs to know how tiny an activity you could add to that done list, right? Nobody needs to see that you put made coffee onto it. And yet that sense of actually having exerted agency in even a tiny way, if you're in a, I'm not a qualified therapist and need to not pretend I'm giving advice to people suffering from depressive disorders and things, but actually that any level of sort of engagement and efficacy with the world, I think there's lots of sort of research reason to believe is the path towards better and better things.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm going to testify to the virtue of this, is that I've been doing this since before I read Meditations for Mortals. That is what I do, and it's built on some research from Teresa Mobile at Harvard Business School, who found that the single biggest day-to-day motivator on the job for people is making progress.
Right.
And
is that the small wins stuff?
Small wins is part of some of Richard's is about small wins. I think small wins is connected to this, and I can see a lot of small wins in your in the stuff that you've written about getting started, about finishing stuff, about doing. And so, but Amabile's work found that in this pretty remarkable piece of research that the single biggest motivator day to day was making progress in meaningful work. And the challenge, in my view, is that we don't always see the progress that we're making. And so we need to establish rituals to memorialize that progress. And so what I do at the end of every day is write down 3 ways I made progress. I very rarely look at it again.
Right.
I don't share it with anybody else, but the ritual is good. And for those of you out there in fan TV land who are skeptical of this, ask yourself whether you've done the following, which is, you start your day with a to-do list. And then in the course of the day, you do something that's not on the to-do list. And then you write that thing on your to-do list for the sole purpose of crossing it off. That's the psychological mechanism that Oliver is surfacing for. So a done list is I think a really powerful, simple tool for people to overcome that feeling of productivity debt. Let me give you another one that was useful. So I was doing that. Let me give you another one that was useful to me, because I do want to turn this conversation fully back to my experience.
Whatever you want.
Was super helpful. And you're a journalist. I'm a journalist of sorts. There's an old journalistic adage: always extrapolate from your own experience. You're not that special. So my view is that if I found it meaningful, other people would too. And I think it's true for fan. So tell us what to do. So you look behind me in my office here. I got this giant pile of books. I haven't read anything there. I aspire to read them all. All right. I've got over here another pile of articles. On my Kindle, I've got stacked up even more articles. And what I have basically kind of a giant reservoir of stuff that I want to read. And I feel like I never make a dent in that, or never sort of take much out of that reservoir. Your book says something that I thought was powerful and very helpful to me, is that I'm using the wrong metaphor. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think the sort of the list of, or the stack of things to read, is both something that weighs heavily on a lot of us, and is just like a really good sort of epitome or archetypal case or whatever for all sorts of other things that we face in the modern world. And the point there is simply that the supply is, to all intents and purposes, infinite. The supply of things that genuinely feel like you really ought to read them. I write a little bit in the book about how there was a time when people were arguing this problem was going to go away because we were going to really sort of filter this huge stream of stuff and just get the stuff that we wanted. but there's an infinite supply of just the stuff that we want, right? Once you've sorted the wheat from the chaff, you just get kind of, it's just like a fire hose of wheat is aimed at your face. So
you quote Nick Carr as a great line about this.
Yeah, right. It's not. I'll get it wrong, but it's not the question of finding a needle in a haystack, but being confronted on a daily basis by haystack-sized piles of needles.
Exactly.
Right? And in that situation, and I would argue that this applies in other areas as well, but like in that situation, the only meaningful approach you can take is to treat that to read cue not as what I call a bucket, but reservoir is another great way of putting it, as you did, which is something that it's somehow your job to empty.
Yeah.
But as a river, which is just something that sort of flows past you, or maybe you're like standing in it and it's flowing, and just sort of pluck out items that go by that seem like they particularly, you have some intuitive connection to those specific ones, or you're in the mood right now for consuming them, and not to feel guilty about all the rest of the water that like you don't manage to catch. It's just the wrong model for finite humans to sort of stake our sense of self-worth or of making progress or anything else on getting our arms around infinite supplies of things.
Yeah. So look at your to read pile, your podcast to listen to pile, your Netflix, Hulu, choose your streaming service to watch list as a river, not as a bucket. Very useful to me. And also get past the idea that this is for the seven of us who still read print publications. If a print publication, a newspaper, magazine comes into your house, you are under an immoral obligation to read it and finish it. And you're saying, I feel so exonerated by that. Again, but so I like this. So there's some really, really good, smart, practical stuff. Do a done list. Mm-hmm. Think about your to read list as a river that's just going by and you take what you want, rather than a bucket that endlessly has to be empty. You also say that there is, let's go back to doing for a second, that there is a power in simply doing. There's a power in simply starting. Tell us about that.
So I occasionally phrase this whole argument as being kind of against good habits, just to be sort of contrarian about it. I think there is a temptation when you want your life or your work or an organization or whatever to be different in some way, to think of that as kind of like a project of change that you have to embark upon. So a classic example, and let's use the sort of meditation, the class, formal meditation example. Like you want to meditate more in your life, so you figure out, or you try to figure out how you're going to do this every day, what time you're going to do, you get the right equipment, you set up the chart, whatever, to try to day after day after day inculcate this new habit. And this kind of thing can just make it either so daunting that you don't even start, and you say, well, I got to wait till I've got more bandwidth, so do this in a few months' time. Or maybe you get really excited by this project, and then 2 weeks in, it's so monotonous that you can't bear to carry on. Or something goes wrong with these attempts to kind of change who we are, that sort of implicitly say there's something wrong with me or something inadequate, and I've got to fix that in order to become the kind of person who does this sort of thing. And everyone wants a system for inculcating habits or for getting over the motivation problems or whatever. And nobody wants to hear that actually the real answer is that you just do the thing, however imperfectly. You just, in this case, sit down and meditate for 5 minutes today, perhaps barely even knowing what you're supposed to be doing when you do it. Same could apply to exercise, creative pursuits, anything else, right?
Absolutely.
And not with any confidence that you're even going to come back to it tomorrow or the next day. Just it's that ability, and I've struggled with this so much, but that ability to sort of bring yourself to just actually do the thing now with no sense of security about I am embarking on a big project of becoming a better person. That is a kind of a superpower if you can cultivate it.
Absolutely, but it requires understanding imperfection. And it requires essentially not only tolerating, but leaning into imperfection. So if you think about the case of meditation, you want to start meditating. Okay, you know what? Try it. And if it's for 30 seconds, you started. Now that's imperfect, but you started. You've done something. And I think that one of the things that I've discovered over my life is that we often want to understand and then act. But in my case, I've seen all over the place that action often precedes understanding. That acting and doing is a way for us to understand.
Right.
And that sort of just getting started is really important. You also talk a lot about the power of finishing things. We talked a little bit about this with crossing stuff out, but tell us, you say something like there's a mysterious energy to finishing things. So we're gonna have our done list. We're gonna think about our reading list as a river, not a bucket. We're gonna just do stuff. Not gonna wait around and plan it out or come up with the perfect system. We're just gonna do stuff. We're also gonna finish stuff. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you would have thought, or I would have thought that if you have a whole bunch of kind of open projects and things that have been hanging around for ages, that actually finishing them would be very tiring and boring and tedious. But the truth is that when you finish something, I have found anyway, it has this sort of extraordinary, there's something incredibly energizing about the sort of act of finishing something and moving it off your plate. And I love that you're making this more practical, but I always want to sort of drift off.
Go for it. Yeah.
Philosophy. I think part of the reason here is that that acknowledgement that is inherent in that you can only really ever work on one thing at a time sequentially, because that's how our attention works. Because you're sort of falling in line with reality when you do that, and I think you benefit then from. It's like you're swimming with the current of how life works instead of against it. So, I think that for the same reasons of kind of not wanting to acknowledge our limitations, we often do develop these long lists of kind of projects that are open and not finished, partly because the beginning of a project is the perfect time for a perfectionist. It's like, treading into virgin snow.
Exactly.
You can still feel that it's all going to be perfect this time. Then you run into reality and it gets a little bit imperfect. So the first thing you do is you go and start another project and get to feel perfectionistic about that one. And then secondly, subtler, really, I don't quite know how to explain it, but I think that there is some sort of sense that if you have a lot of projects open, there's some sense that partly it's just that shows you matter, right? Like if there are 10 people waiting for stuff from you, then you must be important. If you have all these things you've got to do, then almost by some weird inverse logic, I think we believe we must be going to get the time to do them. There's some strange kind of denial of mortality or finitude just in the idea of being that busy.
Yeah. There's a false economics to it, which is essentially that if you create enough demand, the supply will emerge.
Right.
And it's false because of the finiteness for the finitude. And that's I think it's just in your overall way of thinking, and the way that your thinking has transformed other people's thinking, is this notion that things are finite, right? Your life is finite. You might have only 4,000 weeks. There's a finite number of things that you can do in a day, in a week, in a month, in a lifetime, and sort of just not denying that and not lamenting that, but just simply looking that devil of finitude in the eye and saying, this is the reality, let me contend with that. And what this requires, to another point here, and it sort of piggybacks on the point about economics, is a reckoning with trade-offs. Why do we not reckon with trade-offs, and how can we do it better?
I think the reason that we don't reckon with trade-offs, the reason that we sort of try to avoid the tough choices that come with being finite and making decisions about how to use our time, is because every time you do that, as you say, right, you're stepping into the sort of conscious reality of limitation, and it's much nicer to avoid that. So, the simplest way of coming at this is just opportunity cost when it comes to time, right? if you spend several hours on the weekend getting through your email, you can't spend those hours with your family. If you spend those hours with your family, you can't spend them in deep silent meditation, right? There's a choice at every point. And that wouldn't be the case if we sort of lived forever, or if we could be in multiple places at once. All the different ways in which we're limited are what create that that scarcity, basic economics, I suppose. And so I think there's a sort of weird and almost unpleasant comfort in indecision, in not making choices, and indeed in sort of pursuing time management systems that are purportedly going to let you do everything, because again, it's a way of avoiding that confrontation with choice. And there's a quote, each of these chapters has a quotation, I should really have said at the beginning, that from somebody else, that kind of the chapter then sort of partly plays off against and unpacks. And the one in that section is from Sheldon Kopp, the late psychotherapist, who said, "You're free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences."
Exactly.
Which is this amazing, amazing thing that like echoes around my head all the time, really. It's like, actually, you never literally have to do anything. You just have to decide whether you're willing to shoulder the price, to pay the price of not doing it.
Yeah. So you have to, accept that you can't do it all, and recognize that the trade-offs are going to they're going to be costs to those kinds of trade-offs. You have to make peace with trade-offs. You have to focus on completion, not perfectionism. So in a way, I think some of the themes are: forget about perfection and recognize the finitude. Recognize that things are finite. But
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to butt in quickly and say, like, that's a big reason why we're always postponing this moment of truth in the future where we're finally going to get sorted out, right? Because as long as you're en route to this time when you're going to be able to do everything and not have to make any tough choices, it's very sort of provisional, but at least you don't have to face the reality that no such time exists. So there's a big sort of secret payoff in that sort of living always for the future, which is that, like, maybe in the future, this trade-off free, problem-free life will somehow be possible.
Right. You have this idea that you don't worry as much about future you. You have a chapter about future you, which is actually related to another fan guest, Hal Hirschfield, who wrote an entire book about future you. But you also have this lovely anecdote about Sam Harris, where we're sort of looking for perfection. We're saying, as soon as I get this done, everything's going to be cool. As soon as I work out this ugly relationship and smooth that out and get this piece of writing done and clean up my office, I'm golden.
Yeah.
And you have a nice anecdote from Sam Harris where he has a reckoning with that approach. Tell us about that.
Yeah, he tells this story about being at coffee with a friend, I think at lunch maybe, and he's sort of moaning on about all the problems that he's facing in his business, mainly, I think, at the time is what he's talking about, as I recall. And she just sort of interrupts him and says, "Hold on, are you still under the impression that one day you're going to get to the stage of your life where you don't have problems?" And he sort of realizes with a start that that's exactly the illusion that he was sort of unconsciously operating under. Yeah, there is this incredibly powerful sort of double objection that we bring to any problem that comes our way, which is firstly the problem itself, the thing you've got to work out, and then secondly a sort of objection, a sort of indignation at the idea that you still have problems at all, because weren't you supposed to get to the point in your life where you didn't have problems? The thing that always strikes me in my own case is crazy about this is, like, sometimes you can fall into thinking about this being sort of months or years away, but it's quite possible to live for a future moment that's about sort of 2 hours in the future, right? Where you're just sort of like, just by the time I get to the end of today and I get this thing and this thing done, like, then this beautiful sunlit plateau of problem-free existence will come. And, like, as I argue in the book, firstly, not going to happen. It's baked into our being finite that it's not going to happen. Secondly, you wouldn't want it to happen, because although there are certainly certain kinds of problems that you wouldn't wish on anybody, the total absence of problems per se in life would be extremely bad. I think it would be equate to a meaningless life. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's an extremely interesting point. That sort of that's the if you pull on this philosophical string enough, you realize like there's actually something adaptive about this sort of baseline level of discontent that we have.
Right,
Because
right.
you know what
Yeah.
I mean? That there is, like, you and I aren't messed up. We're just programmed evolutionarily for flourishing and survival by being so discontent with everything.
I'm glad
Okay.
we've resolved this. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's another thing. There's an interesting tension. I wonder, the book is coming out tomorrow here in the United States. I'm sure it's gonna be another big blockbuster for you. I think it's, as I said to everybody out there, I think it's just a really terrific book. It really made me think. It changed the way that I look at some of the stuff I do in my own life. There is a tension in there that I wonder if you're going to get, which is that you're talking about embracing our limitations, and how do you square that idea of embracing our limitations with the fact that the people who are watching this, you, myself, like, we have ambitions. We want to do big things. We want to contribute. We want to achieve. How do you square that sense of, hey, there are limitations with I think the very natural impulse to contribute, to do great work, to make a difference?
It's a great question. And I think on some level, the book and lots of my writing is an attempt precisely to kind of square the fact that, just in my own personality, to the extent that this is self-therapy, right? I would like, and I have long wanted to have more peace of mind, and also, and calm, and have a sort of, feel more relaxed and less anxious. And on the other hand, to make space for ambition and for wanting to do things that make a difference, and for that not to be in order to plug some inner void of feeling inadequate, but just because actually doing stuff that makes a difference in the world, it can be a sort of delightful expression of the fact that we have that agency as humans, right? And so I actually don't think these contradict each other at all. I think it's definitely, I see the scope for the objection. You say, like, listen, lower your sights, stop aiming to do everything. There are people who then say, well, like, how does anything sort of impressive ever or sort of big, I guess, ever get done? The answer is it gets done precisely because you're not trying to stay completely on top of all the other little things, because you are willing to make those difficult decisions about what to focus on when. It really, I feel very sort of passionately about this. It's in acknowledging your limitations that you become freed of this or somewhat freed anyway, of this futile struggle to sort of get total control, or feel in control of life.
Yeah.
And that's exactly when you can just do the bold and courageous things now,
right,
because you're no longer waiting for the time when you feel absolutely ready. I think the other part of this is a line that I mentioned in the book, which an anonymous internet forum poster attributed to his French-Canadian grandmother, which is the saying, c'est fait par du monde, which in Canadian French anyway, could very roughly translate as people did that, right? That if you look at anything in the world other than just things that are just part of the pure natural environment, any impressive thing that anyone ever did was done by somebody limited and finite and flawed.
Exactly.
And
I think it's a beautiful way to,
right.
I think it's a beautiful way to look at it. Like, so here we are talking through the magic of Zoom. Somebody did that.
Right, right. And they were not superhuman. They may well have had to put in a lot of effort, a lot of work. They may have got lucky. They may have had some privileges. There are all sorts of things in play, but they were not other than finite, limited human beings.
Family Action Network, which has been around for several years. It's brought people together to discuss ideas, been a huge contributor not only to the American life, but especially in the Chicagoland area. Regular, finite, flawed people did all that. So I think there is something heartening, and there are these kinds of sort of feelings of tension and contradiction here. I think it's one reason why you have a lot of quotations from people who are the sort of Zen priests and monks and so forth, who are willing to embrace those kinds of contradictions. We got a bunch of questions from Oliver, from the folks who are watching here. Here's one. I hear this question a lot. I'd be curious to think what you think of it. She says, her name is Lucy. She says, given our finitude, what strategies would Oliver suggest for deciding on what is most important to home in on if we're overwhelmed with attractive and meaningful options? So you say, there are all these things I want to do. All right. How do you pick one? And she says, for me, long lists of want to do's don't work. Neither do meditation or vision boards. So you've got these things. You're saying, I respect finitude, I respect limitations, but I got to pick one. How do I do that?
Right. A couple of thoughts spring to mind, and it's a very good question. The first is to notice, I think, that even in the demand that it must be possible to locate the perfect answer to the question, there is a kind of perfectionism, right? There's a kind of there's a little bit more embrace of limitations to go, which is the point at which you see that, like, if there are 30 meaningful ways that you could spend a Saturday afternoon, I don't know, just pick an example, then it actually matters less than it feels like it matters which one you choose, right? Because you will be filling that time with something that really matters to you, that makes you feel alive, makes you feel like you're using your finite time well. So there's a name for this paradox, and it's escaping me today, but it's the more that we feel torn between two equally worthwhile arms of a dilemma, that actually the less it matters which one we choose, because they're both got so much value. That's obviously, only going to go so far when you actually feel torn.
But there's something to be said for pick one thing and
see what happens,
and start doing something, rather than being paralyzed with the possibility of all of these kinds of options.
And then just very quickly, I think the other way to talk about that is the sort of Jungian approach that says, like, what's life asking of me here, rather than what do I want to do? Like, what is my reality actually asking of me? It's just a kind of useful reframe that can often free things up there as well.
Another kind of reframe that I've heard people use is not sort of like, what should I do, but sort of, where can I make my biggest contribution?
Right.
So sort of get out of your own head, think about what you can bring, what you can bring to the world. I don't want to elevate that. I don't want to elevate that too much. We have, I just want to get some of these listener questions or viewer questions here. It says, Reed says, I enjoyed your BBC Maestro series on 4,000 Weeks. Any plans to do a series for Meditations for Mortals?
Not currently with BBC Maestro, but I think there are definitely I have been thinking about ways to take this material further, especially because it has that kind of that sort of course or retreat structure. So it's an interesting thought. But no,
I think it's a great idea. I think you'd have a big audience for that. Here's one that's a personal question. This is from Leah. She says, I'm curious about this. Is there anything you wish you'd done or experienced more of before starting a family? I have to say, I'm so in the camp of someone who left it very late to start a family that my sort of overwhelming thought in that regard is that I wish I'd started sooner. How old are your kids?
We have one son, he's 7.
Okay.
I, with all the attendant frustrations, I basically love being a parent, and whatever indecisions were and other things were causing that delay. I sort of wonder what was going on there in hindsight. I mean, but to answer the question sort of honestly, I don't think it's about, so it's hard to put myself in the shoes of someone who's sort of got the reverse concern, but I think part of the thing that's so true about all of this stuff is that you can't really, like, you can never know in hindsight. Like, you are the expert on regret rather than me here, but my theory is that a person who is prone to regret will regret whatever choices they choose and don't choose, and the person who is not prone to regret will be much less likely to regret whatever they did. So I'm not sure it even makes sense to think about what should I be doing now so that I don't regret not being able to do it, when there's something that, I'm trailing off here. But anyway, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it.
There's another personal question I want to get to very quickly here, which is from Mary Beth. She says she wants to know, what brand of pencil is Daniel wielding? And this is a Faber-Castell jumbo grip. I'm kind of a pencil geek, so I don't know if you can see that Faber-Castell pencil. It has these like nubby little handles here. I love them, but I love pencils more than I like people. But that's enough. That's another story altogether. Okay, so you've been at this for a long time, Oliver. You've written a couple of books. You wrote this column for The Guardian for a while. What's a piece of advice you've heard in the world of self-help or productivity that really grates on you?
Well, I could pick all sorts of kind of really like saccharine, positive thinking kinds of, things about how if you just imagine large piles of money, then you'll become incredibly rich. I think the one that would be more apt to what we've been talking about and maybe more challenging, because it's the kind of thing that people in my circles and maybe in the audience here will want to stick up for, is this phrase that I've seen attributed to a lot of people, that we're human beings, not human doings. This is something that
you talk about that in the book. I'm with you.
Right. And there's a sort of, there's an implicit attitude that I know where people are coming from when they say we're human beings, not human doings, right? We shouldn't be measured by our activities. We shouldn't be measured by our output. But I think that that is a much too narrow sort of understanding of what doing can be. And in a significant way, I think this book is all about doing. And I think doing is doing when we're doing things in the right spirit is how we be, it's how we are as human beings. So I sort of reject the implication that if you really saw the truth about existence, you would sort of float passively through life, not really doing things.
Interesting.
Which maybe isn't what everyone means by that phrase anyway. But
no, I think it's interesting. I mean, again, we talked about this briefly. Like, I think that I really do think doing is underrated. That doing is a prelude to knowing in many cases. Rather than knowing always being a prelude to doing.
Right.
You have here's a very interesting question from Jared. I got a bunch more for myself. We're running low on time. Jared says, it's easy to be cynical about so many things, but what is something that you believe in, trust more than you used to? What's something you believe in and trust more than you used to believe in it?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind in a very sort of self-absorbed way is that I think I trust intuition more than I used to. I think I trust feelings in my own body more than I used to. And I think I do, probably against all the evidence, have more faith in kind of the power of sort of deep conversation with other people to make change and to foster understanding. It doesn't happen very often in the world these days, but I sort of get more and more into that understanding that everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, or whatever the famous phrase is, and that actually if you can get some acknowledgement of that, all sorts of great things can happen.
It changes your perspective on people. I agree with that. I mean, I think for me, it would be this idea that one thing that I'm completely have discarded is this idea that cynicism is a proxy for intelligence, and it's not.
Right.
That's just complete bullshit, for nonsense. Let me ask, I know you like to go deep philosophical history. Let's talk about intellectual history for a second. How do you think this book would have been received 50 years ago? Is there something about the moment we're in that called for this book to be written now? And would it have been even understandable 50 years ago?
Wow, that's fascinating. I have no idea, but I mean, the thought that springs to mind is, firstly, not in the last 50 years, but just in the last sort of 20, really, while I've been doing a whole bunch of this stuff, I have seen, I certainly don't take credit for this, but I think there has been a sort of willingness among people who might previously have really been very dismissive of the sort of practical and therapeutic aspects of philosophy, to sort of let that back into their thinking, right? There's a big tradition in recent centuries in the sort of Anglo-American world that philosophy is an academic pursuit, and then self-help is a sort of embarrassing pursuit. And I think that sort of come together a bit more. And then I do think that, that sense of being sort of overwhelmed and at our wits' end with sort of personal systems to try to get on top of everything. I think that kind of material would have been pretty alien to people at sort of that stage in the development of the knowledge work economy, with that kind of company structures that kept all sorts of boundaries around how much people were made to feel that they had to do without, when the gig economy didn't exist and all the rest of it. So I do think that on some level these are timeless human problems, but the manifestations of them in the context of to-do lists and how you plan your day, would have been very strange.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the history of the to-do list. Like, I wonder when the to-do list first became a thing. Like, Stone Age, did the people who are making tools, the first tools that human beings used, said, "Oh, work on wheel."
There's a whole story about how the Industrial Revolution then got sort of transported into the world of knowledge work, and that sort of our attempts to sort of turn ourselves into machines. But it's fascinating.
Let me ask one final question, because I see Lonnie popping back up here. So what is one thing that the people listening here can do tomorrow to act on the ideas in this book?
Well, I'm going to resist the urge to say, take up this new practice where you do this or that every day, and say one thing you can do tomorrow is one thing, right? It is a hobby that you have neglected, but that makes you feel alive, a relationship that you want to nurture, but that you have let slide, some aspect of your work that would really move the needle, and just do that for 10 minutes. Just do that thing for 10 minutes.
Great advice from Oliver Burkeman. The book is Meditations for Mortals. It's a great book. It's super readable. It's super useful. Get a copy, read it, talk about it with people. Now back to you, Lonnie.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for, as always, a lively, prepared, informative, moving the conversation forward interview. You're such a great part of the fan family, and we're grateful for your time tonight for sure. Oliver, thank you so much for your time tonight as well. I want to remind everybody, both Oliver and Dan will be at After Hours, which is going to start, let's see, what time is it? My screen is dimmed right now. It's going to start at 8:05 Central. Let me look, there we go. And that's in 6 minutes from now. So how do you get to come to After Hours? Make a meaningful donation to FAN as you define meaningful. We've been putting links in chat throughout this conversation. Make a donation to FAN, come hang out. Oliver and Dan will be there for 55 minutes until 9 o'clock Central, answering your questions, opining more, giving their perspectives. So come hang out with us. Oliver, I want to just tell you that the book is just incredible. I'm going to ask you a couple questions during After Hours, but I'm kind of going to go a little bit touchy-feely. I'm kind of want to know a little bit, what does it feel like to have someone, whether it's Dan or others, just look at you and say that your words on a page make them feel seen? That people and it's not just Dan who you do know, but people, of course, all over the world, the things that you say hit them in the solar plexus. And it must be kind of a remarkable existence to know that as you put forth and as you produce imperfectly, that you have such an effect on the world around you. I'm interested in how that feels just as a human. So we're out of time now. We're at 8:01, so I'm going to not have you answer that question. I want to thank everybody for coming. We'll see you at After Hours. We're going to open up the room in about 5 minutes. Thanks everybody for coming tonight.